Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Costica Bradatan. He is a professor of humanities in the Honors College at Texas Tech University and an honorary research professor of philosophy at the University of Queensland in Australia. And today we're talking about his book, In Praise of Failure, 4 Lessons in Humility. So, Costica, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I would like to start by asking you, what is failure exactly?
What is failure? I guess we all know it when we see it, right? But sometimes we may have problems trying to define it. The definition I end up using was a combination of etymology and phenomenology. Obviously, when you define failure, you have to bring in success as well. So to define success, I went to the etymology of the word, which in English, as in other modern languages, European languages, comes from the Latin succedere, which means that the fact that one thing comes after another. We are used to this pattern, right? Things happen in a certain order, chronological order. So that succession is something that we get from experience, something we get from observing the world around. And when that succession does not take place, precisely because we have those expectations, we are left with a feeling of frustration, of disruption, of disappointment, and that's failure. So that's where phenomenology kicks in, because my approach more or less is kind of grounded in phenomenology. So in the book, I was very interested in how we respond, how the self responds to this experience of disruption, discomfort, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And in the book, you go through 4 different kinds of failure, and for each of them, you have one prominent figure that you associate with each type of failure. You talk about physical failure, political failure, social failure, and biological failure. So why these 4 different types of failure? Why do you focus on these ones specifically?
Well, because of the word, to some extent, because of the word itself, which in English kind of covers so much ground. Unlike other languages, where we have different words for different types of failure, in English we have only one, and indeed we have that same word even for the agent who fails. We call somebody a failure, right? So I needed some kind of division, some kind of subdivisions of failure, types of failure. Otherwise, it would have been unmanageable. But also, I needed some kind of organizing principle. The book needs to have chapters and needs to have, some kind of progressive order of progression, right? So I start with, again, phenomenological, with that kind of failure that's most remote from us, the failure of things, the physical failure. It's remote not necessarily spatially, it's remote in terms of what we really are and what things are. If some engine, the car engine breaks down, even if it happens in my proximity, that piece of machinery is quite remote from what I am or who I am as a human being. So that's the most remote. And then the next one would be political failure, which is it's still remote in the sense that we may be, political beings, but we don't always engage in politics. It's a special field, it's a special activity, it's a special type of attitude, and so on. We may well, live our whole lives without, being engaged in politics. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it may well happen. Then next is social failure, which is it's even closer in the sense that unavoidably we engage socially. We are social. Society structures us in a quite profound way. Even let's imagine you take go into some retreat away from the world, right, away from society, away from everybody. And still society is with you. Society follows you even there, because you speak a language which is a social thing, right? And even to think in solitude, you employ that language, which makes you social. And finally, there is a layer even closer, and in my book is the closest. It's the ultimate, I call it the ultimate failure, biological failure, in the sense that it's death, right? It's failure, the failure of the body. It's our mortality. It's how we end. But those were, I'm not saying they were arbitrary, but they're not all. They're not all the types of failure one can think of. I had to make a selection. The book needed to have some kind of, to be finite, to be able to be brought to completion, right? So I may well come up with others. But just for that particular purpose, I ended up with 4.
So when it comes to physical failure, the figure you focus the most on, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Simone Weil. So she represents, at least in your view, and as far as I understood it, a praise of clumsiness and pursuing the intellectual life instead of the practical life. So tell us a little bit about her and what she represents in terms of failure and the lessons we can draw from her life.
Before doing that, I guess I suspect we owe our viewers some explanation of a more methodological nature. For each of those, so those types of failure correspond to 4 different chapters in the book, which I call, the circles of failure. But to make that point, to talk about those types of failure, I wanted to bring in every single one of those 4 circles, I wanted to bring in some real human being, somebody, a person, who lived and died and experienced that particular kind of failure, or who had a special relationship to that kind of failure. The reason is that I wanted this to be, it is a philosophy book in an important sense, but I didn't want it to be confined to philosophical readers only. I wanted to have some broader appeal and to make it more accessible and more relevant for people who are interested in the humanities and the big questions, not necessarily, not just professional philosophers or students of philosophy. So in every single one of those chapters, I do have a story. So there is everywhere throughout the book, I use this double tier. There is one layer of text which is argumentative. It's philosophical in the conventional sense. I make an argument or prove a point or whatever. And then the second layer is this narrative. It's it's a story. It's an unfolding story of somebody, right? And they go together alternatively. So there's a couple of pages on physical failure, and then I have the story of Simone Weil, and then I go back to the argument, about the physical failure, and then again. So it's just back and forth, which it also serves to give the reader a sense of rhythm, but also a sense of a certain amount of time to think about, to process, to digest whatever he or she may be reading there. So to go back to your question, Simone Weil was a fascinating figure to study, to explore, to think about. She could be approached from different angles. She means so many things. She did so many things. She was a social activist, and she was a philosopher, a mystic, a theologian, and so many things. From my point of view, from the point of view of this book, she was an extraordinary case of failure, even if she was a very successful person, in her life. In some respects. In others, she chose to be a failure. She quit at some point, for example. She quit her job, her teaching job, to be in the French system of education, to be an unskilled labor, to work in a factory as an ordinary, not just as an ordinary worker, but as somebody as the lowest possible, so on the lowest scale in terms of payment, in terms of qualifications, in terms of skills, and so on. So she wanted to experience. She wanted, first of all, to know what it was like to be a worker. Everybody was talking about the working class, the working conditions of the French people, and so on. And everybody was, there's so much, just like today, there's so much politics involved around her. But she wanted for once to go and see, right, to actually witness how those workers were leading their lives and what their daily lives in fact, in the factory were like, and to come up with an account. So she came back and wrote what she experienced there. What's interesting, and that's again go back to your question, is that as a person, she was a profoundly clumsy person. She was not suited for that kind of work. She was a brilliant intellectual, a great mind, particularly gifted for foreign languages, for example, for classics, for philosophy, and so on, but not for that kind of labor. And yet she chose precisely that kind of activity to make a point, to understand the difficulty of the person, the assembly line, spending their lives in very hard conditions. And she wanted, of course, to transcend her limits in the sense of, learning to live with her natural clumsiness, but also the limits she wanted to better understand the limits of the human condition itself. So you don't have that case of clumsiness, which for me is a very interesting case of failure, of the physicality of our world, right? It's something that happens when we find ourselves ill-equipped to deal with a problem, to grasp something, to manage something. And it's no matter how much learning you invest in that, how much effort you make, there is a point that you cannot move on over. Because you are naturally clumsy, and that's an interesting case of failure where the body and the physicality of the world is heavily involved.
So, but what kinds of lessons, of positive lessons, can we draw from that example?
Well, I would be reluctant to talk about lessons. Well, even if it's in the title of the book, of course, but the lessons that the title refers to are a bit broader. They are philosophical lessons. They are lessons of a different nature than practical lessons that you can learn from something or other. The lessons she learned, first of all, was something very specific about how the French working class was treated, or rather mistreated by society, by politicians, by factory owners, and so on. So she learned something very specifically in terms of sociologically, psychologically, in terms of policies, if you like, from that experience. But of course, much more importantly, again, she's because she's such a special person, she learned a lot about theology. She went into the factory to learn about the working class, the working conditions of the French workers. But she came back a mystic. She came back almost converted, not necessarily to Christianity, but to kind of a highly spiritual way of life. She was looking for the French worker, and ended up discovering Jesus Christ, because the way in which she describes the condition of the workers kind of is very, because as you read those texts, her diaries and so on, the language becomes more and more religiously charged. And eventually she sees herself, there in the factory as a slave. But that language of slave is not necessarily. Of course, she knew what slavery was. She had studied the classics, and the Asian world where there were so many slaves around. But more importantly, for her, slave had a theological meaning, very much like in the gospel, where you read that Jesus Christ came into the world as a slave. So that's the meeting, that the encounter that happens there. Simone Weil discovers Jesus Christ under this unexpected guise of the worker, of the humble, oppressed, over oppressed worker.
Mhm. So let me ask you, because this is something that you get into when you talk about her life as well, but as you said, you go through some of the philosophical aspects, and then you also go through the life of the people you explore in the book. What effects do you think things working flawlessly would have on us? I mean, what kinds of effects would perfection have on us? Do you think it could be something negative?
Yeah, that's one of the points I make there. There is a sense in which if nothing breaks down, if everything works smoothly forever, we ended up useless. There'll be no room for us there, because it's kind of it's the system, the work, the things are self-sufficient. There's no room for us, no need for us. We ended up, as some kind of appendix, unnecessary and useless and so on. But more important, that's one aspect. We can just take a break and go somewhere and read a book or do something interesting. But more importantly, if we place ourselves in situations where there is too much perfection, where there is perfection, that affects our minds, affects the way in which we function, internally, because it's kind of we stop paying attention to things. I'm trying to say is that we need to be challenged. We need to be, we need to wake up. We need events. We need occasions to wake us up, to make us think, to make us make a decision. We need to become aware. Otherwise, we fall asleep. There's a regularity. We because of how things are, we end up living in a pattern, inside and within a heavily patterned existence. Everything comes in patterns. Which is good, which is natural, right? It's life itself has this tendency to happen, to take place in patterns, and we develop patterns when solving problems, when leading our life. We cannot afford every day to do something, to start from scratch our lives, to reinvent our lives completely. We need those patterns, but when those patterns kind of take over, when they occupy too much of our lives, there is this danger that we become useless, and we in turn become routine. We become kind of automate. We need to stay alive. We need to remain spontaneous, and that automation, which first comes in the outside world, we cause it. We build. We invest in automation, right? But somehow there is a strange process where we ended up automated in our own minds. Much of what's going on inside our heads becomes a form of automation, and that's a problem. I think we cannot afford. If we fall victim to that kind of automation, we die little by little, while still alive technically.
Right. So then you get into the topic of political failure, and the main figure here is Mohandas Ghandi. But before we get into Gandhi himself, why do you think that we are drawn to political movements?
In what sense? I mean,
I mean,
What
because
to specific to certain kinds of political movements or in general?
I mean, if existentially speaking, there are particular reasons why we feel drawn to being part of political movements, if we get some meaning out of them or something like that.
Well, I guess that's a good point. It's an interesting question. It's a modern, it's a kind of a post-Renaissance thing. Before, even if we are political animals and we've always been interested in politics, up to let's say the Renaissance, only a limited number of people were doing politics. You are, if you're a king or I don't know, a pope or advisor to the king or to the pope, you were actively doing politics. Most of the other people were not involved. They were, silent, uh, not participants. They were spectators. They were just witness in the best of cases, just witnesses. And the politics was done, without them. But with democracy, well, of course, you do have in the ancient Greece, but those are exceptions. But through, from the modern, with modernity, there we have there's very different ways of understanding politics, and especially comes with the parliamentary democracies, where politics is no longer done by a very limited number of people, but by more and more. First, there are male citizens, and you have women, and you have other classes, and so on. And today, pretty much, except for I don't know, children or non-citizens, today it is expected that everybody has to get involved in politics. We don't, and that's a pity, because there should be more of us who go to who vote. That's one thing, right? But I guess the question can also have a different layer, in the sense that why are we attracted to radical political movements? I guess.
Mhm. Yes.
That's why it's interesting. I guess it's connected, because it's if politics was not accessible at all, there'd be no point in getting involved in radical movements. Once politics was democratized, let's say, I guess after the French Revolution, right? Why politics was spacious enough to embrace a large number of actors. We do have those forms of radical involvement, and that's interesting. It depends on so many things, right? It can be the expression of a failure, in the sense that the failure of the democratic process. We have, for some reason, some people are left. They feel that they are left without options. They have to do something radical. Just voting, every 4 years or every 2 years is not enough, or standing up, for elections. But somehow there are people who want to do more, to kind of participate in forms of political life that are not part of that process. They want to do a revolution. They want to do, I don't know, coup d'etat. I don't know. It's because of the I don't know, because of some form of impatience. They cannot wait for 4 more years. They want to do it now. Because of a lack of trust in the political process, they don't trust the system, that they want to do it their own way. Because of their, I don't know, rebellious nature, they don't want any procedures. They don't want to follow anything. They just they want to kind of demolish the system and perhaps create something new from scratch. I don't know, but it's a good question. So
So, getting into Gandhi, what were the several different ways that he experienced political failure?
well, before I get there, I guess he had quite an intimate relationship to failure, in the sense that even before he was actively involved in politics, he wrote his autobiography, which was published when he was still, he just got back from South Africa, back to India, And it was 1925, I think, when he published that book. So it's so the biggest, accomplishment, his biggest political accomplishments were ahead of him, had not happened yet, and yet he felt this need to write his autobiography, to come up with a story, right, of his failures, because it's a very strange book. It's an interesting but very strange book in the sense that it's an account of his long history of engagement with failure of one kind or another. He complains forever, like, endlessly. He complains that he was a terrible kid. He was such a terrible student, and then that he was a terrible husband, he was a terrible father, and so on and so on. But of course, that's his own account, right? That's his own story. When no matter how harsh you are with yourself, when you are the one who produces the story, you are in charge. You have some control. It's you know what to select, what to put in there, and what to leave out, and so on. So it's not a totally innocent process there. But of course, after that, we have the Gandhi we all know, right? The Gandhi, the public person, Gandhi, the Mahatma, the face of India, of the struggling of the India struggling for independence. And we do have a series of failures, starting from small things like the way in which he dealt with some of his associates who left him, were unhappy because of his political style, and so on. But the biggest would come later, and they would somehow involve him and his life as well, in the sense that he was killed eventually because of some of those failures. His murder, his assassination was in a way the expression, or the spectacular, the visible expression of those failures. He was, in the end, he was perceived as a traitor by some Indians, as an ineffective figure, as somebody who kind of messed everything up, even if the country had become independent now, right? There's so many of them. So in the book, I try to cover some. The book was not, of course, about Gandhi per se. He's one of the characters. So I had to make a selection and focus on some of them. So they're the failures of Gandhi, the politician, that I paid some attention to. They are the failures of Gandhi, the guru, because he was also a spiritual master. He wanted to teach Indians how to live better lives, how to redeem themselves, how to become spiritually superior. And I don't know. They're the failures of, as he himself said, of Gandhi, the husband, Gandhi, the father, and so on. So I'm not sure we have time to go into all those details, but those would be some of them.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, generally speaking, what do you think that the political life of Gandhi teaches us about the value of failure in the political realm and how to approach politics?
Good question. What I try to do there, even if it's not immediately intuitive, I connect, or people don't expect that to be done. I connected Gandhi to a certain kind of bad utopianism. So I went back to his Hinsvaraj, the book he wrote while he was still in South Africa. Hinsvaraj, a very important book, very interesting, also disturbing book, because well before he moved back to India, well before he was a fighter for independence, Gandhi wrote there some very strange things. It was an anti-Western manifesto, not just anti-Western, anti-modern manifesto, in which, for example, he blames for the ills of India, of colonial India. He blames England, of course, the British Empire, but more specifically, he blames certain features of the Western civilization, of which England was part. Namely, he blames railways, doctors, lawyers. It's a very strange argument he makes. Because he's saying that, well, because of those things, India is in the state in which it is. All those things. So yeah, and he comes up with very strange arguments and odd examples, like I don't know, there is hunger and poverty in India. How come? Well, because of the trains, because we have railways and trains, individual farmers can ship away their crops and they can sell them, for a better price elsewhere, and which means that the local community of those farmers would remain without enough to eat. Also because of the trains, people move around, people travel, right, and along with them travel, bacteria and microbes and so on. So basically what he's saying, trains and railways spread disease. And the same with doctors. It's the doctors are, you can, I don't remember some of the phrases, I think some diabolical figures for him. Because why? Because they do vivisection. For Gandhi, there was a no way. So to produce some kind of medicine, you have to test it first, and you would test it on animals. And for him, that was an absolute crime. And and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very peculiar book. So to go back to your original point, he has a solution for that. So all those ills, which he identified in that book, could be removed, could be solved by kind of resurrecting this India of old, this classical India civilizations, where of course there are no trains and no doctors and no lawyers, but somehow is a pure place, a place where people live spiritually and so forth. So that's kind of, to me, that reads like an utopia. He was dealing here in utopianism, and what that was. Right, as we discussed earlier, that was first. It was in the early 20th century. Decades later, when he goes back to India, he's in a position to kind of design politically the independent India. He tries to put some of that into practice, and it was a disaster. I mean, and if I can use one word, is purity here. We don't. So he was obsessed with purity, including political purity. And perfection, of course. So what he wanted was a perfect country, was a perfect India, was a perfect, pure, perfect community. And that was a problem, because such things cannot happen while, in this world. We are not pure, we can never be. We are not perfect, we can never be perfect, and so on. So to try to kind of bring into being, into existence, some kind of utopian project where you claim that this community, this society is perfect, that's a very dangerous political project. And of course, I tell his story alongside with the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, where we have similar attempts of creating this perfect society where there's no exploitation, no equality, no inequality, and so on. But in the process, they would exploit a lot. They would kill millions. They would destroy everything. How is that possible? So you have something at the very core of there is something at the very core of the utopian project that profoundly undermines it.
Mm-hmm. So, and now talking about social failure, the main figure you bring into the book is Emil Cioran. So, could you tell us why you chose? Tell us a little bit about Cioran and why you chose him to represent social failure.
Because I love him. He was such. He was a fellow Romanian, and I had this. I knew of him long before had my infatuation with his work. He's a classic here. He's such an interesting. So he's intrinsic. His work is intrinsically interesting and valuable. But then his life story was likewise compelling. And I kind of sketch his biography in my book. I had to kind of present some of the episodes, some of the more memorable episodes of his life. He was very early on. He became infatuated with the Nazis, for example. A brilliant man, highly gifted, and so on. He goes to Germany to finish his education, graduate education, and he falls in love with Hitler. He wakes up. That would last for a few years. He wakes up. Then he gets infatuated with the Romanian Iron Guard, which is the local fascist movement. And so after a number of political failures like this, he decides to stay away from politics altogether. He moves to France, adopts French as his language. He had been working before in Romanian and German, both of which he spoke perfectly. But now he feels he has this need to choose a third language, a totally new language to him, in which he would become a really good performer, because he's French. As anyone would, any French speaker would tell you, is splendid and memorable, and his texts are accomplished stylistically and of course philosophically as well. So he goes to France to technically do his PhD or some PhD, but from the very beginning, he has this idea that he will never finish. He will never write a dissertation. So his plan was to move to Paris and live the life of a parasite there. He only wanted access to the student cafeteria and dorms and so on, to live cheaply in Paris. That was all he was after. So his life now enters a new phase. He's no longer political. He has become quite distinctly apolitical, and his life has a new dimension, a new style. He's like a Diogenes. He's a cynic in Paris. Does not have any belongings. He does not belong to any school, any institution. He lives off charities. He lives very humbly, but philosophically. He's very proud of that kind of life. He writes back, he writes home. His letters to his parents are kind of, express this sense of accomplishment. I'm very happy like this. And that's when he writes those French books, starting in the late 40s, when one after the other they come out and then reveal just this new kind of thinker. He was hailed as a fresh thinker by a number of critics, and Camus, for example, realized his Cioran's worth and so on. He would never have a proper job, and toward the end of his life, there are some interviews which I used. He would be very proud of never having had a proper job. He would say at some point, "That's my biggest accomplishment. That's my biggest accomplishment. The fact that I never had to have a job, that I didn't have to destroy myself with an office job, with a career." So he was not outcast, because nobody kind of rejected him. He placed himself at the margins, and as a distant observer, as a contemplator. He would not have any kind of commercial engagement with the world. He would not make a living. He would not be a good consumer, a good citizen, and that put him in a position to observe, to see how things happened. the Frenchmen around him were leading their lives and spending and engaging in capitalism, whereas he all that time he was an observer, which was again gave him plenty of insight. You could tell as you read his books from the later period. He was a good observer of the French life, and not just the French, but the modern Western civilization.
Mhm. But I mean, looking at his life and his philosophy, do you think that it tells us, and when it comes to raising failure, as you do in your book, what do you think it tells us about how we think about what it means to be successful in life?
Excellent. Yeah. Well, it's an alternative viewpoint. It's a very important, very it's a compelling alternative viewpoint. The viewpoint of somebody who chooses not to get involved, somebody who decides not to have a job, not to be a productive member of society. It's a very different lifestyle from the mainstream. We all we aspire to have careers from the very beginning. We are set up, we are wired to become, to compete, to acquire, to possess, to move up, to kind of outwit, outdo, outspend the others. It's not. It's a life that, of course, we are all doing, but it's not the best. I don't think it's the best life we can lead Cioran and others like him, because he may be a singular figure. He may be a very special case, but he's not unique. There have been others. There have been others like him, and we have in literature, we have some examples. For example, in Russian literature, Goncharov has a brilliant novel exactly about this kind of life of an idler. Somebody who chooses not to do anything. It's not doing stuff, not leading this profitable life, choosing not to be a consumer, is a radical choice which very few of us would be able to make, but to me, a very telling choice. And we have a lot to learn from somebody who chooses to occupy that position. I would say I would pay attention to anyone who does that, precisely because I am myself not able to do it. It's somebody who goes against the strict system, somebody who decides to kind of undermine the whole thing. It's somebody I really need to understand that point of view, because that would help understand our own positions when it comes to productive lives and so on. It's also more important there, I would say. That's the life of contemplation. It's a very important lifestyle, in the sense that you have for centuries, East and West, and the ancient times and in more recent times, we have this figure of the contemplator. And think of the Buddhist monks. Think of the fathers of the church, of the desert fathers. It's this life where you choose not to possess anything, not to work, not to be active. Instead, you want to understand, you want to contemplate. It's a very respectable and very profound and very serious way of life that fewer and fewer of us choose today. But Cioran was one of them. And that's why it's worth, I think it's worth following, it's worth paying attention to, it's worth at least considering.
Mm-hmm. And so the last kind of failure, and then we'll get into some more general questions about failure and its value, is biological failure. And you bring up the example of Yukio Mishima. So could you tell us about him?
Well, he was quite somebody. He was many of your viewers would know a Japanese writer and playwright, and he started out as a writer, but he ended up as being everything. At some point, he was a bodybuilder and a performer. He made movies and he acted in movies. At some point, he even was an orchestra conductor. I mean, it's a you wonder what he was not. It's but so you could sense as you read his story, as you engage with his life, his biography, you could sense a sense of discontent. He was not exactly happy. So even if he was, a productive, successful, novelist, you could tell he at some point he becomes dissatisfied, disenchanted with novel writing, and he wanted something else. He wanted more. He wanted to experience. So he moves quite a bit between genres and art forms and so on. But the crisis is growing. The crisis is growing, and eventually, it's a very complicated story. We cannot cover much here, but eventually he ends up even building this private army, a private like a small army of private soldiers whom he indoctrinates and feeds and maintains, out of his own pocket. You would say, I mean, many historians and commentators said, well, he was a fascist, and he was he wanted to have that private army to overthrow the government, because he ended up he died, he killed himself when he failed at overthrowing the government. He basically staged a coup d'etat, and he failed, and he committed suicide as a result. But it's much more complicated. I try to explain some of that in my book. It's much more complicated. It's you sense as you move on that really what he planned there, what he plotted, was not the overthrow of the government. He plotted his own failure. He had this dream. At some point, he starts fantasizing about his being a samurai. Of course, samurais in Japan had been outlawed in Japan for more than a century. When Japan became chose to become westernized, the class of the samurais was outlawed, and samurais were not in existence at the time. However, he wanted to be one of them, so he wanted to behave. He started behaving like a samurai, inventing some kind of genealogical tree for himself, like a samurai genealogy. Taking up swords. Picturing himself in the form of a samurai. And of course, when you're a samurai, you adopt a certain code of honor, and everything is meaningful, everything you do. And as part of that kind of life, if you fail as a samurai, you have to commit suicide. He wanted to commit suicide. He was toying with the idea of dying, which he saw in very strongly erotic terms, but he wanted to die as a samurai. That's why he kind of, in my reading, he plotted all that coup d'etat, but he plotted it to fail. He never imagined, he never wanted it to succeed. He didn't want to be. He never cared about taking, power or ruling Japan, overthrowing the emperor, whatever. All he wanted was to fail spectacularly in the process, and as a result, as any good samurai would do, to commit suicide, to commit more exactly that kind of ritual seppuku, which was part of the samurai's way of life and death. So it's a long, quite complicated story, of which I could only mention a few moments here, but it's something I would say it's something worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, I mean, the ultimate kind of biological failure, I would imagine, is death. But Isn't the fact that death is a reality liberating in a way? I mean, isn't it liberating to know that wherever we might do, achieve, or all of our failures will not matter at all in the end?
It should be, right? The way in which you frame the question points to a certain understanding of death, right? You said death is liberating, but you know, not everybody sees that in those terms. It's we normally most of us, I would say, tend to see death as some kind of oppressive, scary thing, event, right? There's nothing liberating there. We try to stay away from it. We postpone it. We go to great lengths to avoid it. So it's that kind of the way in which you frame that is coming from a certain spiritual understanding of that. But ordinarily we don't do that. Ordinarily we would do anything. We would do anything not to be there, not to know death, as if, of course, showing the process there's nothing liberating about it. But as you say, and which of course happens to be my own point of view in the book, there is something liberating because you study, the Western philosophy from the whole history of Western philosophy is kind of intimately connected to the experience of death, to teaching yourself that death is something to be embraced. Death is something, exactly as you said, liberating. We have to teach ourselves, but it's a long process, difficult process. It takes a lifetime to do that, to teach ourselves that there is something liberating about it. But it's a long, and you have that in Plato and in Socrates. The very moment of when Western philosophy was born, that very notion was born as well. So it's very interesting how this notion of philosophy as preparation for death, as training for death, death as an experience, as a liberating experience, that very thing was born with the Western philosophy.
So let me read a quote from the book. At a certain point you say, quote, "Failure can work wonders of self-realization, healing, and enlightenment." Could you explain that?
Well, in the sense that a mature, intelligent engagement with failure, for example, admitting, recognizing your failures and trying to understand what's behind, processing them, working upon yourself, trying to, see things from a different angle. All of that, of course, in the first instance, is a form of addressing failure, is a form of, coming to terms with failures and so on. But in the long run, that amounts to a well-lived life, to self-realization. It's if you do that constantly, if you manage to do that, on a daily basis, if you manage to not just to overcome your own limitations and your own imperfections and your own failures, but to kind of place them into a bigger context and see them as part of who you are. And you come to understand that each one of us is a failed creature because we are born imperfect. We are born to die. We are finite. We are, next to nothing. Understanding all of that in a serious philosophical way, that's self-realization, and that comes with a high degree of understanding. If you manage to get there, I think you understand quite a bit about what it is to be human, about what should be our expectations be, what should we do. It puts you in a very different place, a place from where you can see things differently, not just the practical things around you, but see the big questions a bit differently.
Do you think that it is possible for someone to live without success?
No, I don't think success, especially in the sense in which we used the term before as succession, That's impossible because we rely on those successions of events, of states, of things, right? So success is there all the time, right? It's not possible because it would be a totally unrealistic. We are surrounded by success in that sense of succession. But of course, we need to talk about success in the other sense as well, of social success and so on. It would be depressing, I would say. It would be quite depressing. My problem was not that. It's we have success, and we should have. The problem is, what do you do when you don't know how to see beyond? When you kind of you get intoxicated and intoxicated by success, because every social success, and that's not in the mere sense of succession of things, but in the more narrow sense of social success, career success, comes with a high degree of intoxication. When we experience, a big success in our lives, so much in our lives becomes, a blind spot. We no longer see ourselves in a realistic light. Everything is out of proportion. There's so much that's falls into oblivion. We are actually, those moments of major social successes are really dangerous in a sense, because it places us on an orbit that may lead us in a dangerous space. We are no longer in touch with who we are. It's intoxicating, and intoxication is not good.
So I have one last question then. In the book, you at a certain point you talk about failure-based therapy. Could you tell us about that? I mean, in what ways is it a therapy, and what is it about exactly?
It comes, I guess the question is related to your previous question. It comes with the success thing, right? First of all, there is a tradition of philosophy as therapy. It's as old as perhaps philosophy itself. It shows up in Socrates, we just mentioned him, in Boethius, then in Buddhism, and in so many, Montaigne, so many, in Nietzsche. There is this understanding of philosophy, philosophizing as healing. Something happens to you. You get rid of, you get healed. If you engage properly with thinking, philosophizing, philosophy itself, and so on, as a result, you come out a healed person. But it's not, of course, in this way in which I use that phrase in the book is more metaphorical. Failure-based therapy, in the sense that we should kind of try to digest those failures and turn them into health. We should not, just like I said earlier, that success is intoxicating, inebriating, right? We can become drunk on success, which is very unhealthy state to be. We can become healed if we process our failures properly. There is this sense of realism, even sanity in that comes from not so much from failure, but from what failure leads to, which is humility. Because the point of the book is failure not for its own sake, but failure as a way to humility. So for me, and that's the project of the book, the therapy, the healing comes from humility. It's you are brought down to earth. That's humility. When you fail, you are brought down to earth. You are humbled, and that's a place to start again. To start better, because it's a place to be healed. All that flying around, all that intoxication, those big dreams, those moments of hubris, of arrogance, and so on, are not good for your mental sanity, especially and for those around you who would see you as this arrogant, this insufferable human being. So that's the humanity that comes from failure is I would say a key ingredient to that therapy.
Great. So the book is again In Praise of Failure, 4 Lessons in Humility. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Costica, apart from the book, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
They can Google me. They will find it. I have no specific places to recommend.
Okay. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's been really nice to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles de Moray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.